Muito obrigado por terem vindo então a esta sessão em que vamos começar a entrar mais nos assuntos, mais a fundo, a discuti-los. Não vou fazer grandes apresentações do nosso keynote speaker, John Cao, há quem lhe chame o senhor criatividade. Enfim, é conhecido pelas suas obras, pelos vários artigos e livros que escreveu lidando com a inovação. O mais recente é Innovation Nation, que dizem está na base do pensamento político do Presidente Obama e de toda a novidade que ele veio trazer também para a política, mas também para a economia. Enfim, não vale a pena estarmos a fazer mais apresentações, estamos ansiosos por ouvir John Cao.
Bom dia. I think a little bit better when I'm standing up, if that's okay with you. And I want to say that it's a pleasure to be back in Lisbon, and it's a pleasure to be speaking at this important 25th anniversary event, and also obviously to be speaking at a moment in history which represents a number of turning points, I think. As you've probably heard from my biography, I've been involved with the field of innovation now for about 25 years. And in that time, I've accumulated quite a few nicknames, most of which I can tell in polite company. And the one that I particularly like comes from a project I did in the US government on innovation, actually one of the biggest innovation projects in the US government. And after about a year, the head of the project turned to me and said, you know, you seemed very different from us, but now we understand what your role is in our innovation project. You are the Innovation Sherpa. And that's a nickname I like very much because my approach is very practical. It's very pragmatic. Either you get to the top of the mountain or you don't. And my greatest pleasure these days is working with teams of people, whether it be the government of Finland or Nike or a startup company, to get them to the top of the hill of innovation. Now, as you might imagine, this is often very difficult work. Innovation is one of the most overused and least understood words in English or Portuguese or any other language. One of the things that I like to do is look at Google and Google the word innovation as my kind of daily diagnostic test of how much activity there is in the innovation field. And this morning, I can tell you that there were 110 million references to innovation, which is the good news and the bad news. The good news is that people think it's important and they're talking about it. But unfortunately, they're often talking about it in 100 different ways. And especially these days, they're talking about it as a synonym for good. All right? So these days, nobody wants to be not innovative. Just like in the 80s, when entrepreneurship was very much in fashion, nobody wanted to be a bureaucrat. Everybody wanted to be an entrepreneur because entrepreneurship was good. Now the danger is that everybody will want to be an innovator because innovation is good. It's the good stuff. So I think we have to get a lot more critical in our thinking about what innovation is. Now, to help us with that, I'm just going to ask you a couple of very simple questions. So we have some audience participation. The first question is pretty straightforward, which is how many of you in your organization feel that innovation, however you define it, is fundamentally important for the future of your organization? How many of you feel that way? Okay, so about 79%, right? Which is good and not actually surprising given the theme of this conference and your interest. But now, let me ask the second question, which is a little bit more difficult, which is this. How many of you in your organization have a system for managing innovation, and a system that serves just a few simple purposes or functions? Your people know that the system exists, so it works, so it's not a secret, right? Your people know the system exists. Secondly, the system works pretty well, whatever that might mean to you. And third, on some basis, no matter how irregular, the system yields some strategic value for your organization. So, not a secret, works pretty well, delivers some strategic value. How many of you have that kind of a system in your organization? So about 11 of you. Okay, so lest you think this says something about the community here in Lisbon, let me hasten to say that the numbers always come back similar, whether it's a group of executives in Japan or a group of government people in the EU or startup people in Silicon Valley. You know, roughly somewhere between 80 to 99% of the audiences that I meet with say innovation's really important, but usually 10% or less feel they have any kind of a system. So that's the second point. Not only do we have to be clear about innovation, what innovation is, but even more importantly, we have to figure out how to do innovation. You know, most of the people out there who talk about innovation actually are in the business of helping you to understand it. So they wave their hands and they help you to get innovation. But the crucial turning point in innovation these days is about how to go from getting innovation in the sense of understanding it to getting it done. All right? So I'm going to talk about all of these things in my all too brief time with you. I'm going to talk about three things. You know, what innovation is, why it's important, and a little bit about how to do it. And of course, I'm going to frame it in the context of this recession, because there are really, in a sense, two kinds of companies and two kinds of countries these days. Those that feel the threat and run away. You know, we have to cut costs, we have to get more efficiency, we have to be more conservative. And then other organizations and countries that, while they have to be practical, also recognize that times of challenge and times of recession can be exceptional investment opportunities and exceptional times for planting new seeds. Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, last year gave an extraordinary speech. He was cutting the ribbon on a multi-billion-dollar development called the Fusionopolis, which is all about Singapore's digital media strategy. Part of that strategy is a $1.3 billion digital media development fund, just as an example of the scale that they're operating at. And he said, Singapore is in recession, therefore we have to invest more in R&D and innovation. And lo and behold, they did so, right? So you remember your first grade biology where you're in the woods and you meet a bear, and what happens? You know, your heart starts beating faster and your vision gets sharper and your pupils constrict and, you know, your muscles get activated and filled with blood. And why is that? Well, that's the fight or flight instinct, right? Fight, stand and fight, flight, turn around and run away. And that turning point, that issue, faces all of us, right? So obviously we have to be practical. We have to, you know, in a sense, cut costs and batten down the hatches in a storm. But if we're not investing for the future as well at an appropriate level, we're going to wake up when the storm has subsided and find out we have had invested in nothing. That is why it's so interesting to me that the vanguard of the innovation effort in Portugal, as evidenced by this meeting, are people in the, let's say, the ICT or the communications sector. And I believe that the communications sector is going to lead a lot of the innovation in what we've been calling here at this conference the next generation of societal services. When you think about the fact that the bottom of the pyramid, in a global sense, is the opportunity space for adoption of mobile technology, and that for billions of people, their first contact with the internet is going to be the mobile device. And the first contact with some kind of formal education or public health or sanitation information or world news is going to be off of the mobile platform with content specifically developed for it. That's a profound opportunity and a profound responsibility. When we think about the connected world, open innovation, bottom up, none of these could happen without the technologies of connection that in turn lead to the realities of relationship building in an innovation-driven economy. And the death of distance, the phenomena of globalization and global integration are only further advanced by the kinds of businesses that many of you in this room represent. So I'm very happy, especially, to have an opportunity to meet with you. I've spent a lot of, as you know, as you may have noticed, I haven't had a typical career, but a big slice of my career has been in media and new internet-related businesses and technologies. So, I feel a kind of a kindred spirit with all of you. Okay, so we're here to talk about then three things. What is innovation? Why is it important? How do you do it? So let's kind of get to the what. And I'm going to, I want to thank the host, because I actually made a last-minute request, which they were amazingly responsive to, which was to get me a piano. Because as you may know from my bio, sometimes I do a little music. So if I went to the music store and I wanted to buy a song and play it, let's say it's Wave by Jobim, okay? So this is what the sheet music allows me to do. The basic song. And if I bought sheet music, that would be what the sheet music would tell me to do. And I could play it again for you because it's a nice song. It's pretty boring, right? So right away, we have a challenge, right? Which is to kind of Anyway, we have limited time, but, see, this is how I get to sneak in a little piano playing in the course of everything else I'm doing in my life. But here's the point. The point is, anybody could take the sheet music and play the notes that came with the notes. The question is, how do you take the song as a point of departure and start adding more flavor? How do you do different things? So how do you, in short, do this kind of improvisation, which is about taking a framework but going somewhere new? Because I guarantee you, that little improvisation on Wave, I've never played it exactly that way before. So there's something happening there that I want to talk about, because innovation isn't just a wish. If it were a wish, I could say to you, come on up and play this now. And unless you'd been practicing for years in secret, you probably couldn't do it. So it's not something you can just decide to do. You have to practice. In the case of music, you have to learn music theory, the history of music. And then you're developing capabilities. It's like developing muscles, right? Well, innovation works exactly the same way. It's about developing the capabilities to be able to actually create new, valuable, whether they're products, services, business models, or insights about the future. Okay, so I promised you, first of all, a little discussion about what is innovation. I see it here, but I don't see it there. Oh, you see it behind me. Okay, so it's not going to be multi-screens here. So we're going to unpeel the onion of innovation a bit together, and we're going to talk first about what is it. So the dictionary defines innovation as creativity applied to a purpose to realize value. And I thought that was a pretty good definition for many years in my career, especially when I was dealing with businesses, right? So it's easy to understand, right? Creativity is the universal human ability to generate new things. We all have that ability, right? Because that's how human beings are wired. But here's the point. If I'm given a can of red paint and I throw the red paint all over the stage here, right, the convention center is probably going to be pretty mad at me, and they're going to make me pay them to clean it up. But if my name is Jackson Pollock, and I have a safety belt suspended from the ceiling, and I'm swinging back and forth with the can of red paint, right, the conference center might pay me $20 million to be able to cut out that piece of floor and put it on the wall, right? So here's the point, obviously. Something that's creative isn't necessarily valuable. So to be innovative, you have to have both something which is new and something which somebody wants, right? So if I'm up here at the piano, right, and I say, I'm very creative, and I'm going to play something new and creative. I guarantee you that that was very creative. Well, especially the last part. This is like performance art. Is this thing working? Yes, yes. It is, okay. But unless you are a fan of really weird music, John Cage or something like that, you're not going to buy that CD, right? So it satisfies. Are we okay? Okay, it's bon. It satisfies the utility. It satisfies the creativity test, but not the utility test, right? Now, I thought this was an okay definition of innovation until I started working with countries, right? So about 20 years ago, I started working with the government of Singapore. About 5 or 6 years ago, I started working with the US government, trying to pull them into the innovation age. 2 years ago, I started working with the government of Finland. So these are long-term, deep involvements. And I quickly realized the following, which is obvious to all of you, which is governments are not necessarily in the business of creating new products and services to sell at a profit. Governments are interested in innovation because they want to drive progress. They want to increase the well-being of their citizens. Okay? They want to serve some kind of a national vision. So then I came to an enhanced definition of innovation, and this is the one that I actually use most often, and then apparently has gained some traction in the European Commission of late, which is that innovation is creativity applied to innovation is the capability of continuously realizing a desired future. Okay? So here's the point. You can have lots of new stuff that's valuable that you can sell at a margin, but only if you have a sense of purpose do you have, in a way, innovation that drives transformation. And this is where I think the societal perspective is really, in a way, a little bit different from just the instrumental business perspective, because the societal perspective wants to look at innovation as an engine of progress and prosperity. And in order to do that, one has to define this kind of North Star, this vision, this goal to which innovation is directed. Okay, the other point is that innovation is a lot more than new products, new services, new technology. It's all of these things. It can be new business models, new ways of doing things. So, microcredit is not high tech. Microcredit is a societal innovation, which is Mohammed Yunus's Grameen Bank. What's fascinating about that example is that last week they announced that they were going to open operations in New York. So this is an example of reverse innovation flows from the emerging markets to the developed world, because obviously and unfortunately there are a lot of poor people in New York too, right? So that's a business model innovation, right? So when I meet a lot of government people and I ask them, well, how are you doing with innovation? And they say, fine, we increased our spending on R&D. To which I say, because this is my job to be a little bit, difficult, is, yeah, okay, but what about your innovation agenda? Because innovation isn't just about R&D or high tech. It's not just about people in the white lab coats who say, Eureka, right? They have a very important role in an overall innovation system, but there are many other players as well. Okay, innovation is also about a spectrum from what is incremental to what is disruptive. This is a classic, by now, idea in innovation, but it's really worth reminding ourselves about. So basically, incremental innovation is innovation that improves the existing game, right? It makes things better, makes things cheaper, makes things faster. So this year, your car fins on the back of your car look like this, next year they look like this, next year they look like this. That's incremental innovation, taking an existing game and modifying it, okay? Disruptive innovation is about changing the nature of the game, right? It's about a discontinuity with the past, right? The reason that I show this image is because, of course, it's the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, which is an amazing. I had the privilege of visiting it a couple of weeks ago. It was an amazing experience. And, you know, Bilbao hired a lot of the standard consultants and said, what should we do about economic development? And I think most of them said, you're in manufacturing, do more manufacturing. Do it better, do it smarter, add IT, you know, do your re-engineering stuff, right? Nobody in that community said, hire this crazy architect, Frank Gehry, and spend $100 million to build a museum made out of titanium in the middle of the smelly industrial section of Bilbao, right? It's a pretty out-of-the-box idea. But, you know, we're all familiar with the Bilbao effect. The order of magnitude increases in tourism in Bilbao, the renovation of the heart of the city. It's quite a remarkable story. So this is an example of disruptive innovation. So in Portugal, you know, one could say, what are the disruptive, nonlinear innovation streams that one could consider that don't just build on what you already have, which, by the way, is cluster theory. Cluster theory is all about saying, what do we have, how can we get more? It's not about saying, what do we have, let's put that aside, what could we do that we're not doing today? And those are two different ways of thinking about innovation. They're both important. And obviously, those ways of thinking apply to companies as well. Okay, I run something, you know, this is just a day a week for me, but I run something called the Institute for Large-Scale Innovation, which is an NGO, partly because I believe that this whole idea of innovation in society, innovation at the global level, was an issue that was not being paid attention to. And so we're paying attention to it, and we've created a global structure whereby leaders of innovation from many countries can come together to start thinking about how do we work together as global society around innovation policy issues. You know, in the 70s, the Club of Rome said, resources are finite, so we have to think more systematically about physical resources, energy, and so on. Now I'm asserting in the 21st century, we need to think about the finite nature of intangible resources, talent, capital, innovation infrastructure, and how we begin to weave a story around all of that for global civil society. Okay. So 1 down, 2 to go. We're making a lot of progress here, right? Going fast. So the second question is, why is it important? Well, there's a narrow economic argument, which I suppose we should acknowledge. You know, the notion that economic growth comes from new technologies. We know that. Solo says 80%. Perhaps. BCG looks at profit margin growth of innovative versus non-innovative companies. Monitor has done the measurement of equity returns. And so financial performance of innovative versus non-innovative companies, if you pair them up, suggests that there's a return on investment in innovation. But I think the more profound idea, and that's why we're here, is to talk about the role of innovation at a time of transition, what Jeff Immelt from General Electric calls reset. So he said the economic crisis, the current one, doesn't represent just a cycle. It represents an emotional, social, and economic reset. And those who understand that will do well. Those that don't will fail, right? And I think that's very true. You know, this is an extraordinary set of transitions. And just to give you my favorite example, you know, this is Chris Hughes, wise guy, American young man, Harvard College dropout, co-founder of Facebook, who I would argue is one of the principal reasons that President Obama won the election. The reason for this is that, for those of you that weren't touched by the US election, the Obama campaign was masterful at social media, use of Facebook, use of, you know, you'd go to the rallies and they would say, show us your cell phones, and everybody would hold up their cell phones, and they would say, text to this number, and then they would amass millions of cell phone numbers, and they could pump out the message. And I remember signing up early and I have hundreds of emails. Dear John, Michelle and I are so happy, blah, blah, blah. Dear John, Michelle and I'm coming to San Francisco, and blah, blah, blah. Dear John, we need your help, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very, mass customized, personal, right? And Mrs. Clinton ran a classic big media, top-down, big message campaign. In any other year, she would have won hands down. But Obama was the first cybergenic president, and that was a disruptive innovation, right? Just like in the 60s, many of you may remember, we had this important election in the US between Nixon and Kennedy. And Nixon was a real man from California, so when they said, do you want makeup for television? He said no. And Kennedy, being a Harvard guy, was a little more flexibly minded, and he said sure. And so on TV with the hot lights, Nixon started to sweat, and he looked like a crook, which in fact later on we found out he was. And Kennedy looked cool and calm, and the election was very close, but people say that the fact that Kennedy was the first telegenic president made all the difference in that election, okay? So disruption, reset, and the reset is occurring everywhere. It's occurring in business models, it's occurring in our value system, the sort of consumers and green sustainability, and also in the relevance of technology in our lives, just to pick a few examples. Now, the reason that innovation is important, several more reasons. One is that the way we encounter challenges has shifted. There's a whole class of challenges in our lives that are pretty simple. And I have this slide here because I'm going to give you the example of buying a car. Okay? Your car starts to smoke, right? The smoke is coming out of the top. So you have a problem. Actually, you need a new car, right? So you say, I have this amount of money. I'm going to go do some research. I pick a few choices. I test drive the car. I pick one that fits my criteria. I'm finished, right? Problem is solved. Now, that would be nice, except that most of the challenges of the world today are not simple. They're complex, or in the terminology of the literature, they're wicked problems. And that's why we have the Wicked Witch of the West here. But, you think about water policy, climate change, the role of China in the global civil society landscape, financial turmoil, the energy equation. These are complex issues. It's hard to even define the problem. It will be very hard to know that we've solved the problem in any conventional sense. And there's going to be lots of disagreement about what the right way to approach these problems are. And we'll see that in Copenhagen next month. It's going to be a circus in many respects. I mean, hopefully a nice circus, but still a circus. So the question then becomes, how do we use innovation as a set of capabilities to deal with this level of complexity? And, all the stuff that we're interested in here, whether it's the next generation of societal services, think about these buzz terms that, you're hearing a lot about these days. Green innovation, sustainability, energy efficiency, smart cities, e-education, security, wellness, government 2.0 or 3.0. These are all complex or wicked problems as well, or to turn them 180 degrees, they're wicked opportunities, right? Again, you can't address these kinds of issues by sitting around a conference table and having a couple of meetings, right? So then the question becomes, how do you do the work? Designers understand that when you have a complex, open-ended question or challenge, the work takes as long as it takes. You have a special physical environment where you might work. You've got a lot of tools to begin to visualize all the complex elements. Designers understand a lot about collaboration, and that's why, in some respects, many governments now are investing in design, not because they want more pretty teacups, but because they actually want to liberate design thinking into the mainstream of how their societies deal with these kinds of wicked challenges or wicked opportunities. Innovation is obviously also important because much of the current environment is about the unexpected, right? So if it were business as usual, we wouldn't need as much innovation. We just think about improving stuff on an annual basis, like General Motors did until they hit the wall. Why it's important and also difficult is also because there are multiple value systems. So this is actually drawn from the Finnish government's national innovation strategy. This is on the front page. And what it says is basically our criteria for what we will do as a nation for innovation depends upon a balance of economic growth, sustainability, and well-being. Only when those three factors balance out will we take action, right? So that's a very high bar because sustainability, well-being, especially in the Nordic context, mean a great deal, right? So how do we do those trade-offs in terms of our values? And that's why, for us, this global complexity around innovation requires global solutions. This is just a photograph of my institute's I-20 organization, which has now grown to 25 of the world's most senior leaders of innovation from 24 of the most interesting and innovation-significant countries around the world. And that leads me to the big why of why innovation is important, and that is because innovation is fundamentally changing the geography of the world, the economic, political, and social geography of the world. So this is a cartogram. It's a map, software program into which I plugged a bunch of variables that pertain to innovation, both some of the traditional variables like GDP devoted to R&D and number of PhDs in science, but also some new kinds of variables like startups, venture capital, intensity of design education, and so on. And you can find this illustration actually in a Harvard Business Review article that I wrote this past March. So, it's there. There are two things that you should notice, or I'd like to call to your attention about this diagram. Okay? One is innovation capability, muscle, is now exhibited by many countries. In 1945, it was basically the U.S. The U.S. produced half the world's industrial output in 1945. It was the place where everybody wanted to go. It was the place that had the best universities, et cetera, et cetera. And so, many millions of people, like my parents, who moved from China to America, couldn't wait, to have their kids in America, like me, and get the car and the house and buy into the American dream. But if we fast forward to today, 2009, there are many countries in the race, in the global innovation race. That's point number one. Point number two is that a lot of the most significant players in innovation are actually small countries. So you think about Singapore, Finland, Chile. They're all roughly the size of the San Francisco Bay Area, which arguably is one of the hottest innovation centers in the world. And it suggests that impact and innovation, and this is a good lesson for Portugal, is not a linear function of size or population or GDP, as would be the case if we were in an industrial era where the bigger you are, the more effects you can produce. There's no reason why Singapore, a country of 4+ million people with no natural resources, right, should be able to become a global force in life sciences, have the world's, one of the world's most popular airlines, be the second largest container port in the world, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, except for the fact that the country in its own way has mastered some of the lessons of being an innovation nation. So let me take you on a quick tour of the world, because I take my iPhone, I take pictures, I see a lot of stuff. A lot of countries are racing for the high ground of innovation. The story goes back at least as far as this gentleman, whom I'm sure you will all recognize as being Gustav II of Sweden, who in the 18th century, we forget that Sweden was a very aggressive country back before they became very peaceful, and Gustav was a big conqueror. But the thing that he did that was a little bit different from most plunderers and conquerors was that he also appropriated the library of the conquered nation, boxed it up, and sent it back to Stockholm. And in that era, if you were a scholar, you had to go to where the books are, right? So this is kind of one theory as to why Sweden has so much strength in science and technology historically, because all the knowledge kept flowing there because all the books were there. So this is an example of one of the first geo-strategies for innovation, which combined proprietary knowledge assets and a talent strategy, right? But certainly not the last. So here's Singapore. This is the Singapore Biopolis, right? Singapore has 3 priorities for innovation, not 10, not 20, they have 3. One of which is to become preeminent in life sciences, and this is the place in which they're doing it. Now, the important thing to remember about the Biopolis is their plan is to have about 6,000 PhD life scientists there within another 6 years. And as a point of comparison, the National Institutes of Health in Washington, which is the crown jewel of American life sciences innovation, has 10,000 PhD scientists, right? So, but Singapore is 4.5 million people. The United States is 310. So again, non-linearity, right? This is the Fusionopolis. This is Singapore's digital media hub. Beautiful postmodern Japanese building by the architect Kurokawa. And this is the talent strategy. So, you know, I was in the office of the guy who runs the Biopolis, and he said, he noticed I was looking at this poster, and he said, "Oh, you like that poster, huh?" I said, "Yeah, it's pretty interesting. You know, she has a tattoo around her arm of the double helix of DNA." And he said, "Look, let me explain. She's a model. Her mother is Chinese, her father is Norwegian. And I hired her because my job is to make science sexy, quote unquote, right?" And they do that in a lot of different ways. I mean, if you could be any smart young person in the world, and you can apply to Singapore for money, $1 million Singapore dollars to pay for your doctoral studies in life sciences. $1 million Singapore dollars, which is about 650,000 US dollars, you know, 450,000 euros, something like that. So it's real money. You know, as Philip, the guy who runs this program, said to me, it means you can afford your graduate studies and a BMW, right? Now, it's really interesting because they're getting participants in this program from the People's Republic of China and Vietnam and India, and their point is, if you are a world-class life scientist, you are a Singaporean, all right? So, talent, knowledge assets, investment strategy, being a magnet for talent, it's a geo-strategy for innovation. But a lot of other places in the world have this as well. Let me tell you about these places. So here's China, the Talent Plaza of Yangpu Knowledge Innovation Area. Here's Berlin, which advertises itself as the capital of innovation. I didn't know it was, but somebody in Berlin thinks they are. Here's Rio de Janeiro, right? So I think it's a hairspray ad or something. I don't know exactly what it is. Here is Colombia. You know, I've been doing a little advisory work in Colombia, and Barranquilla, Colombia is now the innovation hotspot for Colombia. You know, so go figure, right? It's a global phenomenon. Okay, now why is this important? Well, it's important for many reasons, but one of the reasons it's important, if you remember back, I said earlier that innovation isn't just about people in the white coats. You know, if you think about how innovation works as a web of activities, there's people who discover things, there's people who develop those things, there's people who test them, there's people who relate them to customer needs, there's people who get them in the direction of commercialization, who are the brokers or the entrepreneurs or the translators. There's people who do the market research. There's then the people who do the kind of corporate development, feasibility study, scaling, deployment, rollout, right? All of these people are involved with the innovation process. Now, it used to be in the world that the innovation models depended on being vertically integrated. Now, I'll give you an example. In the pharmaceutical industry, the drug development industry, you had these vertically integrated companies that were in Switzerland or in New Jersey primarily, where all the scientists were employed by the company. They had a wall of security around the laboratories, and everything was internal, right? Vertically integrated. About 25 years ago, that model began to change with the rise of venture capital-backed biotechnology companies like Genentech, Chiron, and so on. But if we fast forward to today, what's stunning about drug discovery is that the resources for doing the work are now available on a worldwide basis. The world is like a buffet table, and if you're the entrepreneur, you can select from the buffet. So I have a friend, for instance, in San Francisco, who has a drug development company developing 2 drugs, and his company has 9 people, not 900 or 90,000, but 9 people. No PhDs, no laboratories, no white coats. All the intellectual capital was licensed from European universities. The medicinal chemistry is being done in India. The clinical trials are being done in Poland. The marketing and distribution are being done through a worldwide array of channel partners. And so there's 9 people sitting in the financial district of San Francisco who are poised to reap the rewards, but are doing it by a global array of partnerships in the innovation area. And you see this also in digital media, e-business, and many other areas, right? So the good news is that the inputs to innovation are available worldwide. The bad news is that there's a lot of competition to see who's going to be in the game, right? So again, to make it relevant to the hometown team here, Portugal's got to figure out where it wants to play in the global value chain in strategic industries that it thinks is interesting. Because the competition is global, the new business models are emerging in interesting and not entirely predictable ways. And Portugal needs to place its bets in the relevant areas. This leads to the ability to do what I call innovation arbitrage, right? So we're going to do some things in Portugal, some things in China, some things in Africa, some things in Silicon Valley. We're going to arbitrage because of the differentials in the pricing or the availability or the sophistication of these innovation inputs. Okay, so 2 down, 1 more to go. We're making progress. So how to do it? Well, doing innovation is complicated. I mean, I could literally, it takes many hours to just go through sort of the basics about how innovation works in an enterprise or in a country. But there's lots of ingredients. That's the point of this particular slide here. But I want to kind of share a few core ideas with you because I think there is a core set of new requirements for innovation. And I'm going to talk about 7 of them very quickly. The first one we've already covered, which is before anything else happens, you need to have conceptual clarity about innovation. Because if you don't, you're just going to be waving your hands and it's going to be vague and nothing can happen. You can't put things on top of a vague foundation and expect to build something. The second is having a vision. The third is having a story around the vision that creates alignment. The fourth is enabling emerging or fuzzy agendas. The fifth is providing the right kind of platform. The sixth is generating a strategy. And the 7th is finding the sweet spot. So let me go through each one of these for you very quickly right now. So vision is nothing more or less than a way to see the future you want. A way to see the future you want. So, for example, here's a vision statement from a well-known company. We will create products that become pervasive around the world. We'll go to the U.S. market. We'll seed with innovations that U.S. companies have failed at. 50 years in the future, our brand will be as well-known as any in the world. Will signify innovation and quality, unparalleled, et cetera. Now, this is clearly Sony. But what's significant is that it's the vision statement that they drafted in the 1950s when they had nothing, right? So this became the DNA for everything that has happened with Sony subsequently. So a vision is useful when it helps paint a picture of the desired future. However, it's not enough to know what the vision is. You have to have a way of communicating it. So this is where story or narrative become important. So this little book here is called The Cliff's Notes for the Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet. In America, our students often are a little lazy, so they buy the Cliff's Notes and it gives them the condensed version. So I could give you the really condensed version, which is, boy meets girl, terrible families, they fight, boy dies, girl dies. And that's the story of Romeo and Juliet. right? But it's not until you're in the theater and have the experience that you achieve what Aristotle said was the purpose of drama, which was to make a change in moral perspective that was so deep that you wanted to live a different life. In other words, transformation, right? So story is about creating alignment, motivation, and giving you the map for changing yourself. It's the emotional experience. And most organizations don't do as good a job of it as they could, right? So, I hope you're thinking along with me. So, what's the vision for Portugal in the innovation game? If innovation is the muscle that Portugal wants to create, what's the question that it's trying to answer in creating innovation capability, right? And then secondly, what's the story around that innovation? I mean, we all read, when we grow up, the stories of the incredible exploits of Portuguese explorers. There's a big monument to them right across the street. There's more than enough story elements here to fuel any number of narratives around a national vision, right? So the raw ingredients are here, but the question is, what is the story? Okay. Then enabling what is emergent. Typically organizations have a lot of we know what we know, which is operational stuff. They have maybe a lot of we know what we don't know, so we have to go do experiments. They may have a certain amount of we know stuff that helps us think about the future, so we call that conventional strategy work or scenarios. But when I want to be an irritant to corporate or government leaders, I will show them this slide and then say, well, what do you have in the lower right box? To get to the unknown unknowns, the future which is fuzzy, which is emergent. And typically the answer is, well, I don't know. I don't know what we have. Or they'll talk to the guy next to them and say, well, what do we have? And maybe the answer will come back and maybe it won't. The fact of the matter is there are a lot of practices for getting at this fuzzy future. A lot of them coming from technology, a lot of them coming from design, a lot of them coming from facilitation. The point is, you got to have something. You got to figure it out. Platform. So where is the work of innovation? So this, where does it take place? This is Matisse in his studio. Artists have their studios. Most offices, sadly, still look like this. The white-collar paper factory, people all lined up. But this is kind of Silicon Valley, where the form follows the function, right? And where there's a kind of an informality that allows for the germination of new ideas. The famous Lockheed Skunk Works is a story of spinning out the experimental, the disruptive work into a separate platform. The story at Lockheed was this guy, Kelly Johnson, was told, you go build new kinds of airplanes. He said, okay, I'm going to leave the physical building. The first thing he did was he bought a circus tent, and he put it up far away from the headquarters, started hiring all the most unusual people, and then boom, they had the first Skunk Works, the Lockheed Skunk Works. Now, obviously, you also need a strategy, and there's an orderly process for doing a strategy. You need the vision, you need an audit of capabilities, formulate the strategy, figure out who's responsible, and then a campaign plan. What are you going to do? Is it a Skunk Works? Is it new initiatives, creating infrastructure, working on the climate, working on human capital? There are many, many elements. Whatever it is, there needs to be a very kind of integrative and comprehensive picture of this. The final point is you got to find the sweet spot. And this is a music term, right? Music term in the sense that, for those of you who are jazz lovers, you know that if you listen to the jazz of the past, it sounds very obvious, almost like elevator music. But if I were to play you the jazz of today, it might sound very unpleasant and dissonant, right? So the question is, where is the sweet spot between what is familiar and what is strange? And when you find that sweet spot, you have enjoyable, interesting music, all right? So, music. Music is an interesting phenomenon because it has kind of a control system. I mean, those of you who are musicians know what I'm talking about. Here's a piece of sheet music by Chopin, and all the little round things are notes, so he's telling you where to put your finger on the keys. And then there's a little asterisk at the bottom where, Chopin is saying basically, here's where you put your foot down on the pedal, here's where you take it off. And then he says allegro molto, which means very fast, and agitato, which means kind of agitated in mood, and MF means mezzo forte, which means loud but not too loud. So, Chopin's basically telling you everything to do. And, in the literal sense, your job as a musician is not to play new notes. So it's not to be innovative in the sense of playing new notes. So if I am playing the Italian Concerto by Bach, Bach was a very innovative guy. But my job is to play the notes that he wrote, not to add new notes. So I have no freedom. I can play it again and interpret it differently, articulate it differently. So it sounds, I don't mean to say there isn't creativity in musical performance, but in the literal sense of producing new notes, the job is the composers and not the performers. And that's how it works often in companies too. Here's sheet music for innovation from the manufacturing literature, which is, I've never understood this, but it's kind of like, ideas are generated, and then they turn into squares, and some of the squares turn dark, and then there's this word ship at the end. So it's kind of like the sheet music for doing innovation. The other way of doing music, as I demonstrated earlier, is jazz. And the thing that I want to leave you with is the principle that, jazz has structure. Jazz obeys principles of music. So, for instance, in Western music, there are 3 chords that are fundamental. There are the 1 chord, the 4 chord, the 5 chord, and the 1 chord. I'm not going to do musicology, but just bear with me. So these are the 3 chords. This sequence of chords is so fundamental that it's called the Amen cadence, because it obviously came from a divine, it's so perfect, right? It came from some special place. So, I've just given you the principles of 200 years of church music and classical music. You've heard these chords before. All right, so it's also the underlying structure of this kind of music. So the blues, right? So listen to this. Right? It's the same stuff. So blues is based on the same harmonic structure of classical music, which is also based on the anatomy of our ears and how sound waves propagate in air. It's quite amazing, actually. And if I were to play this, it doesn't sound right, right? So there are certain laws of harmony. Then improvisation always starts with a tune, unless it's kind of, free jazz, which is possible, but not terribly attractive. So all jazz starts with a tune. So, here's another tune. That old tune. All the Things You Are, very famous. And that's the sheet music. That's what I got in the store. It's very dry. It's horrible. But, so my job as the jazz musician is to try to make it sound good. So part of it is harmony and color. So that's still the melody, but it sounds hopefully a little better to you. Now here's the trick, all right? You remember the melody. That's the melody. It's written on the little round things, the notes. So my job now is to take all of this and try to go somewhere new. So just to play you a new melody. And I guarantee you, I don't have sheet music. I'm not really thinking about anything right now, but if I start to do that, anyway, blah, blah, blah. So I could do this all day. I could turn it into a blues. I could start up high. There are all kinds of... The point is, I have a capability. The capability is creating new notes on demand that hopefully sound good. Jazz is a capability. Jazz musicians get up on stage, they count off, they start playing new notes. So that's the key point here is it's a capability. It's not a wish. And so what's going on here? Well, what's going on is managing balancing acts. So balancing acts include expertise, what we know, and being open-minded. So it's the balance of the sheet music, the expertise, versus the beginner's mind, what Zen Buddhists call beginner's mind. And it's quite interesting. Zen people have a saying. They say, in the mind of the beginner, in the mind of the expert, there are many opinions, because there's a lot of knowledge. In the mind of the beginner, there are few opinions. And therefore, all new knowledge begins with the beginner's mind. Right? So when I'm sitting up there, I'm trying not to think a lot. I'm trying not to think about what I'm going to play, or, I'm in Lisbon, and, there's all these senior people here, and, I want to play extra good. The less I can think about that stuff, the more the music will actually emerge, right? But if I don't have the knowledge, it's not going to emerge either. So that's, a balancing act, right? Similarly, there's a balancing act between how it's done and how it could be done, the new stuff, right? What you have and what you could get, right? There's a balancing act also between taking risks versus being safe, right? How experimental versus how safe. And in a funny kind of way, let me see if I can find that piece of paper. So, I learned something very interesting this morning, which is that there's a famous poet in the Portuguese literature named Luís Camões. Did I pronounce that right? So, and he talked about, saying to the voyager, well, maybe you shouldn't go, right? Well, maybe you shouldn't, right? It's risky. And there's this inflection point between embarking and not embarking, which is very challenging, right? And that is the tension that I think Portugal finds itself in today. Portugal, to me, has the potential of being the smart, small, west coast of Europe, southern Europe, west coast of Europe country. Just like Finland and Sweden and Norway are kind of like the smart, small Nordic countries. The fact that you're all here, the fact that the industry is behind innovation, the government is behind innovation, puts you ahead of the game. The fact that you have a global network that's linked by bonds of language and culture and business practice is a huge advantage. All right? What's needed is to step up, to really say, how do we bring more innovation to our innovation agenda? How do we create a strategy that serves a big, noble goal? What does Portugal choose to stand for in the global innovation economy? Well, I'm not sure I've heard the answer to that question yet, right? And how do you choose to tell the story to your people and to the world so that we get it? We get what Portugal's approach is. And then most important of all, it's to say, when you ask what the right way to manage innovation is, that you would say to yourselves, it's this way, because it's typically not one way or the other, but it's both. So, thank you very much for your attention, for having me in Lisbon. Sorry I went on a little longer, but I figured it'd be good to share the full story, especially with this great piano here. Thank you.